which means that at least half of you will completely ignore the contents of this statement, or maybe it means all of you will believe only half of what I'm about to say. I didn't know math was never really my subject. In any case, I'd like to thank Dr. Green and for the introduction to the Department of Education Reform for inviting me here today. And I also want to thank all of you for coming. And for those of you I've had a chance to meet previously who've welcomed me, thank you. I was asked to talk about media coverage of education in general and education reform in particular. Is the public's widespread distrust of the media, as reflected in that poll, really justified, at least with respect to education coverage? I have no doubt that anyone who follows education policy in the U.S. as closely as you folks do will find that the general interest media coverage, which you find in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or USA Today, or NPR, or CNN, and so forth, to oftentimes be superficial or just plain lazy. Education reformers have a particularly tough time getting their side of the story told properly, for reasons I'll explain. But first, we should put this discussion in context, I think, and realize that it's not just the topic of education that the media does an adequate job of covering when it comes to simply informing the public about the available facts. Let me give you a couple other examples. Take gun violence in big cities and the effect of gun control on crime rates in general and on the murder rate in particular. It's been repeated endlessly in the media and in academia, for that matter, that Britain and various other countries with stronger gun control laws than those in the U.S. have murder rates that are only a fraction of the murder rate here. The clear implication is that it is the gun control that accounts for the difference in murder rates. But how often does the news media take the extra step of testing this theory that restricting gun ownership lowers murder rates? This is not a difficult thing to do, since we know that murder rates are lower in some countries with stronger gun control laws than the U.S. See if there are other countries with stronger gun control laws than the U.S. that have higher murder rates. See if there are countries with widespread gun ownership that have lower murder rates than some other countries with lower gun ownership rates. See if the murder rate differential between the U.S. and Britain originated with the onset of gun control laws. These are simple questions. The answers are easy to find, and the public would be better informed about the link between gun control and violent crime if the media bothered to do a little digging whenever they ran a story about some politician or public policymaker pushing for more gun control laws. Here are some facts, courtesy of a recent book on intellectuals by Thomas Sowell. Russia and Brazil have tougher gun control laws than the U.S., yet they have much higher murder rates than we do. Gun ownership rates in Mexico are a fraction of what they are in the U.S., but Mexico's murder rate is more than double what ours is. Handguns are banned in Luxembourg, but not in Belgium, France, or in Germany. Yet the murder rate in Luxembourg is several times the murder rate in Belgium, France, and Germany. Switzerland, Israel, and New Zealand have relatively lax gun control laws, yet their homicide rates differ little from those found in England, which is to say their homicide rates are a fraction of those found here in the U.S. And what about the murder rate differential between Britain and the U.S.? Well, it turns out that New York City has had a murder rate that is some multiple of the murder rate in London for more than 200 years. And for most of that time, neither place had serious gun control laws. In fact, murders committed without guns have also been several times as high in New York as in London. The point is that it's hard to find any consistent correlation between gun ownership and violent crime rates, either internationally or within the U.S. Yet the fact that the murder rate in England is lower than it is here continues to be cited as proof that gun control laws reduce the murder rate. And the way the media reports this story leaves the general public not only less informed, but ill-informed. Here's another example. Ever notice how preoccupied the media are with black-white comparisons and how quick they are to infer that disparate outcomes between groups proves discrimination? For example, the fact that black applicants for mortgage loans are turned down at a higher rate than white applicants has been widely cited as proof of racism among lending institutions. The Washington Post, for example, reported that, quote, a racially biased system of home lending exists. The Los Angeles Times quoted Jesse Jackson saying that banks, quote, routinely and systematically discriminate against African Americans and Latinos in making mortgage loans. But the very same data that show blacks being turned down at higher rates than whites also show that whites are turned down for loans at higher rates than Asian Americans. Is this proof of racism against whites and in favor of Asians? Another study a few years ago showed that black pregnant women in the U.S. receive prenatal care less often than white pregnant women, and that infant mortality rates among blacks were substantially higher than among whites. Now, the media automatically assumed that the first fact was the cause of the second. They assumed that this demonstrated society's institutional racism, and they assumed that what was needed was more government spending on prenatal care. The New York Times reported that 1/4 of the infant deaths in America were, quote, easily preventable and were primarily attributable to their mother's lack of prenatal care. The Washington Post pushed for legislation to provide vital assistance to pregnant women who do not afford normal medical care. But the very same report that showed disparities in infant mortality, in fact, on the very same page of the report, statistics showed that Mexican Americans received less prenatal care than blacks, and that infant mortality rates among Mexicans were no higher than among whites. If anyone in the media had bothered to test their black-white disparity assumptions, it would have been obvious that something other than prenatal care was responsible for these differences in infant mortality, just like something other than discrimination must be responsible for the disparity in mortgage lending if whites are turned down for loans at higher rates than Asians. I just want you folks in education to know that the press is not picking on you. Our incompetence knows no bounds. By the way, the data on infant mortality rates for Americans of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino ancestry also showed that those groups received less prenatal mortality rates than whites. Again, there are countless other examples, but the point is clear. Journalists love to draw conclusions from these simplistic black-white comparisons, even though adding one or two other groups would render their conclusions invalid. And as a result, the public in general, and voters in particular, are given an incomplete or distorted picture. Journalists regularly employ inductive reasoning, which, as you know, has inherent pitfalls. Just because we know that A is known to cause Z, that discrimination can cause unemployment, for example, we still cannot infer A whenever we find Z if B, C, D, etc. also cause Z. We, the press, have to examine other factors besides discrimination in producing vast statistical disparities, and too often we don't do that. So what's going on here? Is it indolence? Is it ignorance? Is it bias? I read stories all the time about how we need national standards for K through 12 education because countries that outperform us on international tests have national standards. That's true. But it's also true that many of the countries we outperform on international tests have national standards. How often do you hear the media report that? I've read countless stories about the importance of smaller class sizes for improving educational outcomes. Yet rarely do I see it reported that many of those same countries that outperform us on international tests have, on average, larger class sizes than what is found in the U.S. So again, what's going on here, at least with respect to education coverage? Is the press just lazy or indifferent or predisposed? Well, I'd argue that a number of factors are to blame. Broadcast and print journalists do work under constraints of time and space. Every fact and counterfact can't make it into every story. Also, in recent years, a number of print publications have ceased to have someone cover education exclusively. Instead, education issues are added to the beat of someone covering, say, City Hall or the state legislature.
So there's a manpower factor at play as well. There's also the fact that at many papers, the education beat is treated as an entry-level post, a stepping stone to a more prominent position. As a result, turnover on the education beat can be high, and you often get inexperienced reporters just trying to learn the ropes, let alone the nuances and intricacies of complicated collective bargaining agreements, or the significance of mayoral control of schools, or whether charter schools cream, or how local teachers' unions influence school board elections, and so forth. But I think one of the biggest factors has to do with the preconceived notions that print and broadcast journalists bring to the education beat. And this is a particular challenge for education reformers who are trying to get their side of the story out there. The reality is that the press corps, on balance, is not merely left of center, it's quite liberal. This matters because education reform, by and large, is about challenging the liberal education establishment, which means challenging the teachers' unions, who are not only a force in education, but a force in democratic politics. In 2006, to pick a random year, the National Education Association, which is the nation's largest teachers' union, gave millions of dollars collected from mandatory dues, I should add, to Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition, and to the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, and to Amnesty International, and to an outfit called AIDS Walk Washington, and to dozens of other left-wing advocacy groups. Now, many of the NEA's donations at least target groups that ostensibly have an education mission. It's given money to the Central Collegiate Athletic Association and the Center for Teacher Quality and so forth. But many other donations are a real stretch in this regard, to say the least. The NEA, for example, has given money to the Human Rights Campaign, which lobbies, quote, for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender equal rights. A few years back, it gave to the National Women's Law Center, whose website at the time featured, quote, a pocket guide to opposing Supreme Court nominee Samuel Alito. And it gave $400,000 to something called the Fund to Protect Social Security, which was a group that was lobbying against efforts to reform the entitlement by creating personal investment accounts. In other words, the NEA is effectively a liberal philanthropy organization that also focuses on preserving a public education status quo. The NEA funds the Economic Policy Institute, for example, which regularly issues pro-labor reports that claim education is underfunded and teachers are underpaid. People for the American Way, a partisan Democratic outfit that also happens to be vehemently anti-voucher, is also a recipient of teacher union largesse. The extent to which the NEA sends money to states for political agitation is also revealing. For example, one year, Protect Our Public Schools, an anti-charter group backed by the NEA's Washington State affiliate, received $500,000 toward its effort to block school choice for underprivileged children. Never mind, of course, that charter schools are public schools. And the Floridians for All Committee, which focuses by its own admission on, quote, the construction of a permanent progressive infrastructure that will help redirect Florida politics in a more progressive democratic direction, unquote, received a $250,000 donation from the NEA. In other words, the National Education Association, which is the richest and most powerful force in public education, is in many important respects an arm of the Democratic National Committee. And if journalists are partial to Democrats or organized labor, it's going to affect their coverage of education. So that begs the question, just how partial are journalists? Well, since 1962, there have been more than a dozen surveys of the media that sought the political views of journalists. In 1971, the media self-identified as 53% liberal, 17% conservative. In 1976, there was a poll of the Washington Press Corps, 59% liberal, 18% conservative. A 1985 poll of 3,200 reporters found them to self-identify as 55% liberal, 17% conservative. A 1996 survey of DC journalists put it at 61% liberal, 9% conservative. Do you notice a pattern here? Now, the significance of these percentages becomes more obvious when you know where the general public stands politically in contrast to the press corps. For instance, in 2001, the Kaiser Family Foundation polled 300 media professionals, including reporters and editors from the top networks, TV networks, radio networks, and news magazines. It also polled 300 policymakers and then 1,200 members of the general public. The results showed that the media itself is far to the left of media consumers. 4 times as many media professionals told the pollsters that they consider themselves liberal than called themselves conservative. Yet among the general public, self-identified conservatives outnumbered liberals, 38% to 21%. More than 6 times as many media professionals called themselves Democrats than said they were Republicans. But among the general public, Democrats slightly outnumbered Republicans, 34% to 28%. The policymakers who were polled were also found to be less liberal than journalists. A Washington Post story on the poll results went so far as to say that, quote, "These divergences between the public and the press lend themselves to conflict, both with consumers and the makers of news, and threaten to diminish the legitimacy of American journalism." Again, is it any wonder that such a large segment of the public distrust the media and don't believe that reporters are fair? Broadly speaking, whether or not members of the media agree with conservative voters on any given set of questions is not at issue here. The problem is the invisibility of a large segment of voters to the national media, and most especially the inability of the press to represent their views in public disclosure. You can almost imagine, say, some Australian media baron looking at these polls and saying, gee, what if I started a news network that tilted rightward instead of leftward? There might be a huge audience in America for that. And I might be doing a public service besides. In 1992, only 7% of Washington correspondents voted for George H.W. Bush. 7%, compared to 37% of the public. In 2000, only 8% of Washington correspondents thought that George W. Bush would make a better president than John Kerry. This compares with 51% of all American voters. For every journalist who contributed to George W. Bush's campaign, 93 contributed to Kerry's. Put another way, if journalists were a congressional district, it would be one of the most liberal districts in the country. In the district that includes Berkeley, California, for instance, 12% of voters went for Bush in 1992, nearly double the rate of journalists. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, another liberal bastion, 19% voted for Bush, or triple the rate of journalists. Another fact that creates problems for education reformers in particular is that journalism is a heavily unionized profession. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other smaller papers are union shops, with many reporters and editors represented by the Newspaper Guild. The Guild is a subset of the Communications Workers of America, which is a division of the AFL-CIO. This is another factor to keep in mind when analyzing media coverage of teachers' unions and labor issues in general. The media's political sympathies aren't everything, of course, but they do matter. They factor into not only how a new study on vouchers or merit pay or alternative certification gets covered, but also whether it gets covered at all. Press sympathies factor into how a reform-minded big city schools chancellor is portrayed on the local news channel while negotiating a new teacher's contract with the union. Press sympathies factor into whether a local newspaper chooses to mention that a state senator or local councilman regularly votes against the educational interest of his low-income constituents whose kids are stuck in the city's worst public schools because he gets all of his campaign money from the teachers' unions who oppose vouchers and charters. I don't think you can separate public education reform from politics. The reality is that the teachers' unions control public education through their ability to influence politicians and public policymakers. If you want to reform education, you have to take on both the unions themselves and the politicians and policymakers that they influence. And because the press tends to be sympathetic to the teachers' union's broad political agenda, the job of the education reformer is that much more difficult. Over the decades, teachers' unions have done a brilliant job of convincing the media that the interest of the adults who run public education and the interest of public school students are one and the same. The job of the education reformer, in my view, is to make the case for why this claim is false. How does it benefit kids when collective bargaining agreements make it next to impossible to fire even the most incompetent teachers? How does it benefit kids when union rules allow the best teachers to opt out of teaching the most challenging students? How does it benefit kids when pay systems based solely on seniority and degree attainment, as opposed to producing results in the classroom, discourage our smartest college students from going into teaching? 5 years ago, Terry Moe, a political scientist and education scholar at Stanford University, wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that explained the challenges facing reformers. It solicited one of the largest responses I've seen in my 16 years at the paper. Moe explained that teachers' unions have more influence over public schools than any other group in American society. They influence schools from the bottom up, he explained, through collective bargaining activities that shape every aspect of school organization. And they influence schools from the top down through political activities that shape government policy. Yet the American public is largely unaware of how influential they are and how much they impede efforts to improve public schools, he said. The email blast in response to this piece convinced me and my colleagues that virtually every one of the teachers' union's 3 million members had decided to respond. We even ran an editorial replying to the letter writers. But Terry Moe is making a very valid point. The problem is not that the unions are somehow bad or ill-intentioned, he wrote. They aren't. The problem is that when they simply do what all organizations do, which is to pursue their own interest, they are inevitably led to do things that are not in the best interest of children. No one claims that corporations are in business to promote the public interest. They're in business to make money. And this fundamental interest is what drives their behavior. An economist or a public policymaker fully expects businesses to pollute the air and the water when polluting is less costly and more profitable than not polluting. That's why we have laws against pollution. The problem is not that businesses are out to destroy the environment. The problem is that their interests are not identical to the public interest. And the two inevitably come into conflict. Teachers' unions, wrote Moe, need to be understood the same way. Their behavior is driven by fundamental interests too, except that their interests have to do with the jobs and the working conditions and the material well-being of teachers. When unions negotiate with school boards or chancellors, these are the interests they pursue, not those of the children who are supposed to be getting educated. The unions use their political power to keep education reform at bay. With 3 million members, they control huge amounts of money that can be handed out in campaign contributions. Even more important, they have members in every political district in the country and can field armies of activists who make phone calls, ring doorbells, and do whatever else is necessary to elect allies and defeat enemies. No other interest group in the country, wrote Moe, can match their political arsenal. It's not surprising then that politicians at all levels of government are acutely aware of what the teachers' unions want. This is especially true of Democrats, most of whom are their reliable allies. When the teachers' unions want government to act, the reforms they demand are inevitably their own interest: more spending, higher salaries, smaller classes, which means more jobs, and so on. Even though there is no evidence that any of these is an important determinant of student learning. What the unions want above all, however, is to block reforms that threaten their interest. And these reforms happen to be any attempts to bring about fundamental changes in the system that would significantly improve student learning, parental choice, school accountability, merit pay, etc. If we really want to improve public education, we have to do something about the teachers' unions. And I'll close by saying that I think reformers are starting to turn a corner here. Partly it's due to how bad things have gotten, particularly for minorities. The reading scores of black boys in 8th grade are barely higher than those of white girls in 4th grade. Just 46% of black boys are scoring basic or higher in math, compared to 82% for white boys. The achievement gap has not changed appreciably in 3 decades, despite vast increases in education spending. And I think the public is getting fed up. You also see documentaries like Waiting for Superman and The Lottery that illustrate the union problem and the importance of school choice. You see newspaper and magazine articles critical of the education establishment and the status quo. The Los Angeles Times put a database on its website that rated teachers based in part on the performance of their students on standardized tests. The New York Times and the New Yorker magazine have run pieces in recent months that describe just how bad and expensive education has become in our urban areas. Politically, you've seen groups like Democrats for Education Reform challenging liberals to take on the unions. And you have Democratic education reformers like Joel Klein in New York and Michelle Rhee in Washington, D.C., who are willing to fight the establishment in ways that their predecessors would not. And finally, you've got the Obama administration supporting charter schools and teacher accountability. Never mind that conservative education reformers have been saying the same things for decades. The fact that a Democratic president is saying it, and given the media's liberal sympathies, I think education reformers are making some progress. Obviously, there's still a long way to go, and I think the most important work will need to be done at the state and local level, where parents need to be won over by education reforms to create a sort of critical mass of voices for change. But the least that the media can do is to provide the public with fair and accurate coverage of education issues. And based on that Gallup poll I started with, we certainly have our work cut out for us. Thank you. No, if there are any questions.
Jason, my name is Gary Ritter, and I'm in the Department of Education Reform. And I see your point that if the media has a liberal bias, they're not interested in these reform issues. But is education slightly different? I can imagine lots of folks who identify themselves as liberals view many of these education reform strategies that you describe as being social justice oriented and liberal and progressive reforms like charters giving the same choices to poorer kids that violent advantage kids have, vouchers. It seems to me that, at least in the field of education reform, it's harder to be clear-cut on what is liberal and what is not. I know lots of liberals who identify with education reform issues.
Sure, but the fact of the matter is that the organization Democrats for Education Reform is only about 5 years old, so where have they been? I mean, and it's a shame. And as many conservatives have been pointing out for years, the people suffering the most under the status quo are Democrats' constituencies. They're the ones who claim to be the champions of the poor, the champions of minorities. But black kids, Hispanic families have been suffering for years in the worst schools in America. What have their political representatives been doing about it all these years? I'm glad that some are finally stepping forward, but where have they been? President Obama and Arne Duncan didn't invent charters or come up with an idea of merit pay for teachers or holding schools accountable, stuff has been around forever. They've been more interested up until now, I think, in satisfying the unions, because the unions play such an important role in putting them in office. You really can't overestimate the knocking on doors, the phone banks. I mean, it is a political operation, and without big labor support, the Democrats really fear they have trouble getting elected. And I think that is why for many years the union's interests have been put ahead of these poor families. Jay?
I'm going to see if I can sneak in two questions.
Sure.
One is when you describe the political leanings of journalism as a profession, I think about academia, and there have been other surveys which show a similar slant, but I understand why academia is able to have a slant like that. It's because academia is not really responding to market forces, and so it doesn't have to produce information that's representative of other people's preferences. It can produce whatever it wants, and it's a self-perpetuating force, so it can hire people like itself. But journalism is existing in a competitive market. So how is it that journalists can be so skewed if there's a market that would... Now, I know you gave the example of Fox News popping up, but if markets are working well, how has the slant in journalism been perpetuated, unless perhaps that slant really isn't having much effect on coverage, which leads me to my second question, which is, if journalism is so slanted to the left, how come the American public doesn't get, is still mostly conservative in their self-reporting? Yeah, they're doing a bad job of convincing people, because the American public seems not to be persuaded by them very much. So is it possible that the bias that you're finding, or the distortion you're finding in the political distribution of journalists, is somehow not really making its way into the coverage, or not having any effect on people after the coverage?
Well, you could be right that it doesn't matter if 90% of the Washington press corps votes one way, that has no impact on their coverage whatsoever. You could be right. I'm skeptical. And it's so consistent over so many years. I'm very skeptical that this isn't skewing coverage. How that is manifest, I mean, maybe some PhD student wants to go out there and tabulate it. But from where I stand, it has to have an effect on the coverage, and I think it does. I do think it's getting better, though, because there are so many more media outlets these days, and you can't paint too black and white a picture. Conservatives have always had outlets. One of the most popular talk radio host in the country is probably Rush Limbaugh, who's been around for 20 years. Now there's Fox News. You have the internet now, bloggers, and you also have the liberal media more conscious of this criticism, I think, and trying to respond to it in different ways. But I don't know if you yet have a counterweight exactly in place yet, though, even if things may be moving in that direction. Yes.
Looking at the nursing department, in light of your comments regarding this, who really holds the power, the DEA, and maintaining the status quo in education, do you think that the impact that they've had on legislators over time, say the last couple of decades, has had an influence on the number of charter schools that have increased across the country?
I think it's increased notwithstanding their opposition. And they've tried to appropriate some of this reform rhetoric. I think some unions have gone so far as to start charter schools themselves. But with the case of charter schools, it really doesn't make a lot of sense, since the whole point of the charter school is to operate outside of the union work rules and to be more flexible and so forth. So, but I think the NEA has tried to respond to this in various ways. But at some level, they're still fighting the way they've been fighting for a long time. In Harlem, they were backing a state legislator named Bill Perkins, who was opposing charter schools opening up in Harlem. He said there were, too many charter schools were opening in Harlem, and Bill Perkins is funded by the unions, and he ran on this line and won handily on this line. So I still think the unions are at some basic level still fighting against charters, even for appearances they want to appear to be reformers by going so far as to start their own charter schools. So, yeah.
My name is Jeff Dean. I'm a PhD student in education policy at college. And my question concerns what you were saying about the self-interest of unions being misaligned with the public interest of what is best for children.
Often, not always, but often.
Right, not always.
Yeah.
And I agree with you.
And when there is conflict, who comes out ahead?
Right,
Which is the bottom line.
So if that's the case, often, as you put it, not always, then is there something in the laws? Is there something in policy that can be done to redirect what is their self-interest to incentivize pursuit of the public good, or are unions for public employees somehow inherently at fault?
That's
a further.
Yeah, it's just outside of my range of expertise.
Okay.
I'm sure there are people out there who could give you a much more informed answer to that question. My emphasis has been that the media should be covering this conflict that the unions have in pursuing the interest of teachers versus pursuing the interest of the kids. That the public should know what the union's priorities are and how those priorities can conflict with the education of their kids. For instance, on the jobs, the unions refuse to acknowledge there are any bad teachers and will fight tooth and nail to keep any teacher from ever being fired. But we all know there are bad teachers and good teachers, just like there are bad journalists and good journalists, or bad accountants and good accountants. How does keeping bad teachers from being fired help kids? Particularly when those teachers are disproportionately teaching the neediest kids. It's just, there's a fundamental conflict there. And the way that the press has covered that story, I think, has been lacking. Yes.
Patrick Wolfman, faculty, Department of Ed Reform. Jason, in spite of the popularity of class size reduction, we're not yet at the point where public school teachers outnumber parents. So, in our democracy, where the majority rules, when the majority, gets out and makes an attempt, one would think that parents would have the upper hand. They've got the numbers. They've clearly, if what's being done in public schools is not in the interests of their children, they're aware of it because they're the child's parents. So why do the unions win when parents have the numbers and a strong interest in protecting the needs of their children?
Well, there's a number of ways to answer that. I think, for starters, I think the majority of public schools are fine. And the majority of families are happy with the public school their kid attends. Even if it's not some high-performing KIPP school, it gets the job done. Many families, parents have voted with their feet. I mean, my wife and I moved into a certain neighborhood for the purposes of education. That's what I think a lot of Americans do. what most Americans probably do. I think education reform is really about the education of the underclass. That's the focus. I mean, the president and Duncan talk a lot about that statistic that 2,000 high schools in America out of 20,000 are responsible for half of all dropouts. And the corollary to that is that if you're black or Hispanic, you have a 50% chance of attending one of those 2,000 schools. So it's a very concentrated problem that I think most education reformers are trying to address. People talk about the difficulties or the human capital problems of creating 20,000 KIPP schools. We don't need 20,000 KIPP schools. we need a couple of thousand in large urban districts to address a very specific problem. In those districts, parents, well, I might think those parents should be voting on education first and foremost. I think there are a lot of other issues going on. And with respect to education and black parents who have the children in these awful schools, the problem is often that they support the issue, but not the politicians who hold the positions. So it's often the Republican or the conservative in the race that has the right policy for their children on education, but blacks don't vote for Republicans and conservatives typically. So there's that dynamic as well. I mean, look at D.C., what just happened in Washington, D.C. You had a mayor who reduced crime and improved test scores. And he just lost. It makes no sense. I mean, it makes no sense. And these were measurable gains that were being made in the city. Yet he had another black politician come in and run a sort of tribalistic campaign. Oh, this is a majority black city, but you've got a Korean woman running the schools. What's wrong with this guy? It didn't matter how good the schools were doing. It was about racial politics. And so that dynamic comes into play in a lot of places where these reforms are most needed. And I think it explains the political outcomes often. But again, you're talking about a relatively small segment of the voting public. For the vast majority of people, they have made the decision. You know, you either put your kids in private schools or you move to the neighborhood with the good public schools. Problem solved. But education reformers, I think, for the most part, as I found in my reporting, are focused on the underclass, and that's where the real challenge is. Yeah.
The problems are concentrated, as you said, and they're probably mostly concentrated in the districts represented by the Congressional Black Caucus.
Yeah.
And I think of guys like Charlie Rangel and people like Maxine Waters and Jesse Jackson, they don't need to worry about the NEA. Those guys are congressmen for life unless they're kicked out on those charges. Why aren't they leading the charge for educational reform? It's their kids.
But I think they do rely on the NEA. I mean, I think the NEA is probably one of Charlie Rangel's most dependable sources of campaign cash and backing.
I mean,
what's that?
His hand in the cookie jar 17 ways from Sunday, and he's still renominated and will be reelected.
Yeah, but when you talk to these black politicians off the record, many will be very straight for you. These folks, the unions fund me. I can't cross them or I won't have a job. It's really that basic. They won't be out there campaigning for me. They'll back a primary opponent against me. They will punish me. And they're not, it's not an imagined concern of theirs. It will happen.
Is there a market for centrist? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm Mike McShane. I'm a graduate student, Department of Education Reform. My question is there a market for centrist news outlets? I mean, perhaps speaking to Dr. Green's concern, maybe the reason that these news outlets don't are not representative of the public is because they only speak to the choir. Like, whereas so much of our job seems to be trying to change people's minds, maybe folks that are in the center. So folks on the right have their news outlets, folks on the left have their news outlets, and they never really come together. Is there a market for those folks in the center that maybe don't have opinions on this and want kind of nuanced approaches towards them where they can make informed opinions?
There may be. What you're describing is sort of like a British model. Newspapers over there are unabashedly on one side or the other. And whether it's the news side or the opinion pages, the tradition in America has been neutrality, objectivity on the news pages, and opinion pages are reserved for bias and political prejudices and so forth. Whether that model has run its course, I don't know. In some respects, perhaps. I think the cable news outlets are really changing the game here. The CNN model was to try and be straight down the line, and they're at the bottom of the line in ratings. Fox set the tone, and then MSNBC came back and said, we're going to be the Fox of the left. And that seems to be what's shaping up there. But at the end of the day, all those cable guys have a rather small fraction of the total TV news viewing outlets. I mean, the guys, I guess Brian Williams is an anchor now. Someone like him, or the folks on ABC, NBC, CBS, don't have the numbers that Jennings and Rather and Brokaw used to have because of cable news pulling away eyeballs. But they're still much larger numbers than what Bill O'Reilly has. I mean, they're much. So those guys are still swaying, and I still think it matters what Katie Couric's politics are, or what Brian Williams' politics are. I mean, I just think it has to matter. It has to manifest itself in some way, if only in choosing what stories we're going to talk about tonight. Forget about how we're going to cover the story. Just your decision about what is to be covered this evening is, in some instances, a judgment that matters, tremendously.
Let me pursue the question of the media market that you raised in some questions as well. You're in the national print media. You're in the national print media.
We have a TV show as well.
Well, that's true. Yeah. No, I've watched you on it. Yeah, very good. I'd like to get first of all, how important is the national print media still? And I think, and the second part of this question is, well, so the first question is, should we care about my second question, which is, based on your, insider position in the national media, can you give us a prognosis? I mean, there seems to be a shakeout going on. You've gone up against head-to-head, really, it seems, against the New York Times. My wife, who was a long-time devotee of the Wall Street Journal, is thrilled that you now have a fashion section and lifestyle section, all these kinds of things that seem to be going head-to-head to the New York Times. And at the same time, we've been hearing, and I guess USA Today would be the other one, but maybe I'm missing some others. Let me come to the chase. What is, we follow the sovereign risk of Greece and Illinois. What's the sovereign risk of the New York Times? You guys going to win? You going to drive them out?
Well, obviously, I think print journalism is tremendously influential, and you should only read the Wall Street Journal. But the model that newspapers had until very recently is obviously in tremendous flux. Many small papers are closing. Newspapers traditionally have been driven by advertising dollars, not what many people think, what you pay at the newsstand. That's not really where newspapers make their money. It's with ads, people buying ads. And a lot of that has been stolen by the internet in particular. And so the industry, the question you asked is the $100 million question. Where will it all how will it all turn out? I don't pretend to know the answer. The Journal has tried to adjust by in different ways, particularly and most consequentially, I think, in getting people to pay for content online. We've come up with a pay model for our website, the newspaper's website, and that's something that others are trying to follow as well. But as in terms of and as respect to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal newspaper battle, the goal there was to become a more general interest paper. The focus for years has been on business and politics at the Wall Street Journal. And Rupert Murdoch, who brought us a few years ago, decided to make us a more general interest paper, thought New York City could use another serious newspaper to take on the New York Times, and so he's been investing a lot of money into expanding our sections and going after women readers like your wife. And so we'll see.
She reads the financial news first.
It was the financial news first, yeah. So we'll see how that works out. But it's a very dicey time. I mean, young people, newspaper readership is down. Newspapers have to find a way to explain to the public, to the reading public, why they're still relevant. I speak to young people today and ask them where they get their news, and a lot of people tell me Jon Stewart, which is an interesting answer on a number of levels, because when I was growing up with the late night folks like Carson or Letterman, they would come out and do their routines about the day's news. But no one was getting their news from Carson. I don't think. I mean, they'd read a newspaper, watch Dan Rather, then watch Carson make jokes about what they'd read or seen on TV. But to have Carson as your sole news source strikes me as, well, we'll see how it turns out. So the model is in tremendous flux right now, and it's anyone's guess how it's going to turn out. I do feel fortunate to be working at a paper where the owner is investing and hiring still. So we'll see. Yes.
So you mentioned that James Scholl's Department of Education Reform. You mentioned that Democrats, liberals, some of them are starting to come on board. Obama, Arnie Duncan. We see Oprah hosting charter schools and talking about $100 million going to Newark. I mean, so we see Democrats coming on board. And recently, a fairly well-known education reformer claimed, as far as the battle of ideas, we win. So he says we win, the battle's over. Jay something. So he says we win, the battle of ideas is over. Do you agree? I mean, is the battle of ideas over, or is this a George Bush mission accomplished sort of? Or the battle's still going on?
Maybe Jay wants to answer that.
Am I right? Aren't I right?
I think it's a constant battle. You always have interest groups out there pursuing their interests, and that's part of our democracy. And I think the job of the press is to keep the public informed about what's going on and accurately informed about what's going on, and give fair play to all sides of the issue. And that is a constant battle, despite what is going on at the moment in Washington in terms of which party controls which house or the presidency or so forth. That's really I think that's more of a political statement than what's going on the ground. I mean, 80-something% of our kids still attend public schools. Public schools are not reformed. There's still the mechanics of putting in place the ideas that have taken hold, if in fact they have taken hold. and who knows how long the current president will be there and be able to promote these ideas. And will the next guy pick up that banner? Is the press coverage he's getting now, or those ideas are getting now, a sort of cult of personality thing? I mean, Oprah, I think, is a big supporter of the president. If the president and his administration are doing something that she wants to give attention to, that's a factor. So I wouldn't declare victory, and I don't think it's the place of the press to declare victory, but I think it is our place to just continuously keep people informed about these debates and what's going on and the new ideas that come along in terms of what the reformers are pushing, where they've worked, where they haven't. I think that's our job. That's our job. That's it.
I wanted to ask a question about a gap I see, which actually, to me, contradicts the idea that we won, because I think there's this huge area of teacher education that has remained outside of some of these other issues. But the gap that I see, and I can't explain it, is the fact that most teacher education programs are not viewed, even by mainstream journals like the New York Times or others, as something desirable. Almost everybody seems to criticize, and they have for many years, teacher education, ed schools. It's hard to find any mainstream journal having a positive thing to say about this one institution, among others. And yet, if the media are tipped in one direction towards, say, what they think the unions, the NEA, and others have to say, why haven't they connected the dots? Because at least in northern states, most of the higher ed faculty in ed schools are unionized by the NEA's affiliate. And I just don't understand why there hasn't been some look at what everyone realizes the crucial piece of it all. How do you get the kind of teachers you want into your schools to begin with?
I could run off a list of the media's failure to connect dots on any number of issues. It's a very long list. That's another example of one. I cited, gun violence and prenatal care in America. I mean, you could ask why the media hasn't connected the dots between higher minimum wage and youth unemployment. Pretty easy dots to connect there, but they haven't connected the dots. Rent control and high apartment prices in San Francisco and New York City. Again, dots to be connected. I have no explanation of it. Maybe we need smarter people going into journalism, or maybe the priorities of the media need to be rejiggered in some way. But it beats me. It beats me. Yes, Jim. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss? Did you have a big?
I mean, if you're willing to keep going.
Go ahead. Okay.
This is kind of in response to your Carson and Stewart clip earlier. I seem to notice that more and more Americans, as you said, seem to be getting their news from things like Jon Stewart. Maybe it's more my generation, a generation younger than mine. And I think that also might be that more Americans are doing less of the print media reading, which to me is very much more straight shooting. Every morning I watch, while I'm getting ready for work, I watch the early show on CBS, and the line of questioning that they ask folks that they have in is the same every week. How were you feeling when X happened? And tell us what was going through your brain. And it just seems less hard news and much more sensationalism. So setting that up, I also look at how people seem to be more interested in getting their reality with a little bit of entertainment, like reality television, Jon Stewart or the Daily Show and whatnot. So do you think that there's less and less outlets for the hard news, such as I would say the Wall Street Journal, and the Times, and the Washington Post, and there's more of a trend of going for that entertain me with my news? B, is that a problem? And C, how do we, as education reformers, trying to get our hard news out there? Do we need to start a reality show or something like that?
Well, the market reality would seem to suggest that there's less demand for certain types of journalism than there used to be. Those are the facts. If you look at subscription rates, advertising rates, and so forth. I see journalism as a business. Unfortunately, more journalists don't see it as a business. They see it as something else. But I see it as a business, and the market is clearly telling print journalism you're no longer as relevant as you used to be in our lives. And I think it's incumbent on the print journalistic world to become relevant again and go about doing it. The soft news you watch on in the morning on the morning shows, there's a huge market for that. The ratings are through the roof for that. Those are huge money makers. Advertisers love them. I also wouldn't sort of mythologize the past as if this used to be a nation of who used to sit down and read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, cover to cover, and people don't do that anymore. And you could probably make an argument that people today are more informed than ever, given all of the different ways to get news today, whether it's the internet or blogs or TV or what have you. And people used to get more of it from print journalism than they do today, but that doesn't, I wouldn't go so far as to say that necessarily means they're less informed.
As a follow-up, I guess maybe my elitism is showing that, I work with a lot of the undergraduates on this campus, and when they know more about fist pumping on Jersey Shore than they do about waiting for Superman,
I share your sentiment there.
Maybe I can take the prerogative of the last question unless there are others urgently waiting. Marty, you want to get in? Okay. Well, I'll go, and then Marty, you can have the last. So, just on the decimation of journalism as a profession, has this? Tons of people losing jobs. I'm using decimation.
We won.
Yeah, right.
This means loss of 1/10. You may still be safe.
I imagine it's actually been much more than 1/10 of journalists have lost their jobs, especially during the recent downturn. I wonder if that is actually affecting some of the recent coverage that you've described that has, in mainstream outlets, that has been very interested in focusing the light on some things that they have ignored in the past. So, for example, both the LA Times, the New York Times have done features on rubber rooms, right? Places where teachers who can't be fired go to collect their paychecks. Is it possible that journalists are beginning to notice that there's this other category of people who seem to be completely insulated from?
I think that is a factor. The economic downturn, the fiscal state of many states, fiscal situation in many states. The belt tightening that's going on, that nevertheless some public sector employees feel they're immune to having to suffer through. Yeah, I think this is resonating, and I think it explains the popularity of some politicians like Chris Christie in New Jersey, who ran on taking on not only the teachers' unions, but labor broadly, and the special interest groups, and talking about shared sacrifice and so forth. There's something to that. I think there's something to that. Sure.
So, all of you, Bob, you want to? Okay, so Marty and Bob, and then I really mean it. Then we're done.
Okay, it's better enough on here now. So, I guess Rupert Murdoch and News Corp bought the Wall Street Journal several years ago, and we see a few companies that own huge proportions of huge market shares. So I'm wondering, is it moving more towards an oligopolistic industry? Because on the other hand, with the internet, anybody can own their own newspaper, whether it's true newspaper, it's further to the side. But is the media becoming more oligopolistic, or is it becoming more competitive? And what are the implications for reformers who want to get some message out?
Well, monopolies and oligopolies are usually characterized by fewer choices and higher prices. Right? Is that what's happening in news in America? Do you feel like you have fewer choices and you have to pay too much to read what you want? I would argue things are moving in the exact opposite direction, for better or worse. So I see no evidence of that, or that people should be concerned about a few media barons owning everything you consume media-wise. But where is it happening?
Right. But I think, though, that there is a concern, or there's a perception out there that
there's a concern by certain political organizations who exist for the purpose of expressing this concern. Sure, and but they have a political agenda. I think it's pretty clear that. I mean, this gets into the whole issue of net neutrality and media ownership rules at the Federal Communications Commission and so forth. But it's the traditional measures of whether we don't have enough competition in any sector have been fewer choices and higher prices. So unless there's a new metric out there that I'm not aware of, I don't see any reason to be concerned, despite what some politically motivated folks are saying for the interest of pushing their political agenda.
First, I would just like to add another note on the other side about some hopeful signs. That I see things in some areas getting better. The area I study is teacher pensions, primarily, and just over the last 3 or 4 years, the sophistication of the coverage has increased quite markedly. Concepts that would never have been in newspaper stories 3 or 4 years ago, such as which discount rate to use for evaluating liabilities, or the very idea of pension wealth, which takes into account both the annual amount as well as the number of years you collect a pension. That wasn't around in the newspapers. It was around in academia for a long time, decades, but never got into the newspapers. But now you do see it. I don't know how much of that. So now we get to the question of, well, how do we make things improve? I don't. Maybe that's just things. The pressure of imminent death. The financial crisis, not of the newspaper, not of the newspapers, but of the pensions. The things have gotten so dire, people have had to pay closer attention. And here's really the question I want to get to. What do you see as the role of intermediaries between researchers and newspapers? Because I think there are think tanks, for example, that will contract with researchers, and there will even be think tanks they'll go through a few different intermediaries where, as far as I can tell, the only value added is the packaging.
So what do I think of think tanks?
Well, think tanks or other probably I'm sure it's a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag.
Is there some other kind of intermediaries that might be less of a mixed bag? What's your prescription? How can we improve the accuracy of the kinds of reporting that you talked about at the very beginning?
Well, a couple things. First, on the point
how can we, as academics, give us advice for us as academics.
I would not pretend to know how to advise academia. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scholar. I will say this. In terms of recent coverage of dry subjects like pensions, I think that's a reflection, again, of the media's priorities in covering things. Obviously, pensions are not the sexiest topic out there to be covering. You're interested in ratings. You're interested in because we've gone over a cliff. Or are about to. But they didn't get a lot of coverage before. If you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page in particular, nothing that is happening right now in pensions or Fannie and Freddie or the housing bubble would have been a surprise to you at all. But that's not something that gets a lot of play on Jon Stewart. I mean, these aren't topics that that journalists, I think, and editors in particular, think readers are interested in. Maybe that's a condescending view of their consumers, but that is typically a view. Someone told me recently that a New York Times reporter on education issues told him, this was someone at a think tank, that his editor at the Times was not interested in some long think pieces on education policy anymore, or they just he'd been getting rejected pitching these stories to his editors. That's pretty telling. I mean, the Times readership is supposedly one of the more sophisticated ones, and if the editors there don't think their readers are interested in dry policy, where's the popular media going to cover this stuff? In terms of think tanks, I'm of two minds on them. On the one hand, I very much appreciate the work they do and their accessibility and of the material they put out there. It makes my job a hell of a lot easier. So I like that. I think some of them, and this is both think tanks on the left and right, to put it as bluntly as possible, they make the perfect the enemy of the good. And maybe that's what you're supposed to do in a think tank. You've done the research. This is the right way to go. If we're not going this way, screw that politician, screw that public policy official. This is the right way to go. All this other stuff, we're wasting our time. It's a waste of money. Instead of taking a more expansive view, listen, I may disagree with 99% of what President Obama is pushing in terms of policy, but he is giving a lot of prominence to educational choice in the form of charter schools. That can only be a good thing if I care about more people knowing about charter schools. Can I give him some credit for that? Even if I don't think charters per se are the answer to what ails public education. But so I think you at the think tanks sometimes you get a very rigid, narrow-minded, I think, view of how much praise to give the politicians and the public policy, or how much credit to give the public policymakers and the politicians in certain areas. So I'm sort of two minds. But by and large, as intermediaries, I think they do a very good job. And a lot of times, frankly, the think tankers do a better job of explaining issues to me, who need something explained to them at a fourth grade level, frankly, than the academic off at the research university, who oftentimes speaks with a lot of jargon, a lot of assumption that you're steeped in this. And it's not just academics. I mean, some lawyers can't, for the life of them, explain the premise of a case to me on the phone. So it's just, I think, but folks at think tanks seem to do a particularly good job, I think, of dealing with the press. So I rely on them quite often, and I'm happy to have them out there, even if I have some quibbles with some of their views, or some of their approaches, I should say.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.